Redevelopment Agency meeting of Salt Lake City. We are here serving as the Redevelopment Agency Board. We'll begin our meeting this afternoon with comments to the board. And if anyone would like to comment, they can fill out a card, and you have 2 minutes to share your thoughts with us. Is there anyone who would like to do that? Seeing no one, I will share a comment that I received from Mr. George Chapman, who was unable to be with us, but I'm going to read his comments into the record. Winter is quickly coming, and since the Salt Lake City Police are rousting the homeless from camping in the outlying areas of Salt Lake City, there is a significant chance that there will be more deaths of homeless from cold this winter. I urge the RDA board to consider an indoor camping area with minimal rules to encourage homeless to come in from the cold. The proposed ID card will also discourage use of the fenced-off area and is another reason to provide an alternative facility down by the service providers. Note that if there are over 1,000 homeless around Salt Lake City, the fenced-in area cannot fit them all in that area. Also, the State Street affordable housing discussion should include the fact that the building will be an engineering nightmare and could develop, it already has, into a great big sucking money pit. I urge due diligence and an independent analysis of engineering problems that may develop and their cost. There is no easy way out of this, and the RDA could receive a significant financial hit if you go through and take it over. On another note, I am not sure that the 24-hour notice was legal since I got it from the state at 5 p.m. A meeting that starts the next day at 5 may not be legal, especially if no public comment is allowed, and no public comment was said to not be allowed. I'm just reading what's here. I urge you to consult with your attorney to ensure that you follow the Utah law. And those are Mr. Chapman's comments. And in that light, I have asked Katie Lewis, who's city attorney and assists the RDA, to comment particularly on the last portion of that about the notice of the meeting.
Hello, board. Katie Lewis with the Salt Lake City Attorney's Office. Is my microphone on? Okay. Okay. You want me to speak loudly into it? As I understand it, Mr. Chapman's question was whether the special meeting that the RDA scheduled for 5 o'clock today was appropriately noticed and agenda'd. The Open Meetings Act requires that any meeting, as long as it's not an emergency meeting, must be noticed 24 hours in advance of the meeting. That's the minimum time requirement. As I understand it, the RDA published notice of the agenda within that 24-hour time frame, and so the requirements under the Open Meetings Act were met. The RDA also has bylaws that discuss regular meetings and special meetings. The bylaws, which were recently amended, all that they say is that any special meetings may be called pursuant to the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So the board complied with their bylaws as well.
Thank you very much, and I hope that clears things up for people. I appreciate your time on that. We will now move to item B on our agenda, Redevelopment Agency business, and we'll begin by looking for an approval of the minutes, and we will be approving minutes for Tuesday, July 25th, the revised minutes, as well as the minutes of Tuesday, September 2nd. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. A motion by Board Member Rogers and a second by Board Member Johnston. All in favor?
Can I make a comment on that?
Really? Yeah, sorry, a discussion first.
I wanted to ask Board Member Mendenhall if you had an opportunity to review the revised meeting minutes and if that is satisfactory to you. I think last time you had some concerns about some information being left out.
My short answer is yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, you saw them, and yes, you agree with them.
Yes.
Okay, double yes. So with that, any further discussion? Then we will now, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries and the minutes are adopted. Go now to item B2 on our agenda, RDA Capital Improvement Program follow-up briefing, and we'd like to invite Jennifer Bruno and Ben Lutke to join us at the table and take us through the discussion of RDA capital projects. And Danny Walls and Ed as well, Ed Butterfield from the RDA. Thank you. And Jennifer, if we need you, we'll have you come over to the mic, but stay put. Okay, thank you.
Just a note, this item is scheduled for a tentative follow-up briefing on November 14th. The staff report has a couple updates. The first one for the board is on potentially bond-eligible RDA projects. You'll see a table on page 2 which lists potentially bond-eligible projects by the project area, how much it is, and if the administration is requesting partial funding for those projects in the CIP this year. There are 4 of the projects in the table that list no funding target because there isn't a estimate of how much the project would cost, and there's a policy question for the board about discussing with the administration what is envisioned for these projects and what potential funding targets could be based on what the vision is. We also have an update that RDA staff, council staff, and finance met with the city's financial advisors. This is George K. Baum. They are working off of updated cash flow estimates for RDA project areas and the program income fund. And based off of those updated cash flows, they've developed potential bonding scenarios of what the maximum capacity would be for the RDA. And these are not included in the staff report. The financial advisors, after reviewing the information with staff, are going back and they're developing other scenarios that'll then be brought to the board for consideration.
Great, thank you. Board members, you have policy questions or any other questions with regard to CIP funding?
One other thing to point out on this, Madam Chair, is at the bottom of page 1, there are 4 projects listed that are likely not eligible for bonding. 2 of these are legally required. The 10% of the North Temple project area tax increment for a future school, the legally required citywide housing contribution, and the 2 others are not legally required, but we think it's unlikely they would be eligible for bonding. And those are $588,000 for a downtown placemaking incentive program. And this is one of those that doesn't have a funding target. And there's several things that are listed that could fall within this, such as public plazas, mid-block walkways, or incentivizing other public places. But without those details, it's hard to know for sure if it would be eligible for bonding.
Can I ask a question, Madam Chair, on the downtown placemaking component? One of the charges of the new cultural core consultant is placemaking. How are we coordinating with them? Is this separate from that process? Have we had a conversation with them? And I know they've just been awarded their contract, so I mean, it's early, but I'm almost positive they're specifically charged with placemaking as a part of that cultural core contract, which overlays pretty much the downtown RDA area as well.
To answer the question, no, we haven't had that conversation with them. We can certainly reach out to them and see what their goals and objectives are, and then if this program could be something that could help them fulfill that.
So I'm thinking they actually have money allocated for that as well.
Million.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if this is something that we might want to pause on to make sure that we aren't duplicating efforts by the cultural core. And it may be possible that we could enhance some of their efforts too. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that we need some coordination there to make sure that we aren't setting aside money that's already set aside through our sales tax allocation there.
I had the exact same concern, and from my memory, we put $250,000, the county put $250,000, or I'm sorry, yes, and we have a half together for the cultural core. This absolutely would be repetitive if we don't coordinate closely with them, and so I would like to pull it until we have clarity about their objectives and scope, where they're at in their implementation process there. And that I would like us to entertain a conversation about allocating a portion of this money back towards the excellence in the community, which I understand was ceased in June with our budget due to programmatic elements of it. but that there are plenty of placemaking, activation of the space that we already own in the Galvin Center, and advertising opportunities that money could be used for.
And so, Madam Chair, as clarification as well, Board Member Mendenhall is correct. We're about $250,000 each year from the county and from the city, so it's about $500,000 a year. And I think there was almost $1.5 million that was had been banked from that. So there's some pretty considerable money there for them to get started. And I think we need to make sure that we're either supporting or not duplicating their efforts.
Yeah, I think just to add some background, it's my understanding that these funds were
This
targeted.
is Danny Walls,
Sorry.
COO of the RDA.
Danny Waltz, RDA. It's my understanding these funds were originally targeted as part of our budget to somewhat set up a program that we could then reach out to developers and incorporate plaza spaces or public space as part of developments. And so we did not have a specific project in mind, but really just wanted to make it available to developers that we could work with. So I think to the extent that we can reach out to the cultural core and make sure that we aren't duplicating that goal and process, we can do that. And if we aren't, then we can certainly go back and put this out to developers and see if there's something we could coordinate. But
And I think that's appropriate. And what I'm suggesting, Annie, is they have probably a dollar amount requirement for expenditures, and they may be willing to participate with us as a funding component if we want to do a program. So I think we just need to explore those options before
we're happy to
we
explore
commit
that
money.
and report back on where we're at.
I appreciate that, and I would look forward to hearing follow-up on that. But I will say that acknowledging our $2 million existing on the table that's yet to be deployed for placemaking in this same space, I'm not interested right now in $588,000 to do the same thing when we haven't yet seen our existing dollars. And we have the Galvin Center that needs support in ways that we have ceased to support it. And there are other ways we can do it appropriately with the RDA dollars. So I think I'm not quite, let's just make sure we aren't duplicating efforts with the cultural core. I think that we've already made investments sufficient for the scope of work that I've been presented on the cultural core issues. And I'd like to see us look at spending this money elsewhere.
Can I ask a
Yes.
question of Councilmember Mendenhall as well? You referenced that I understand that the Excellence Performance Series came up against some of our recent legal interpretation about programming. Is it your understanding that there are other opportunities there that they may be able to, we may be able to support them financially that wouldn't run into that?
Yes.
Okay. Do we have a dollar amount for that? Do we know?
We were at $200,000 a year, which was
But do we know how much we can fund that?
with
Yeah.
non-programmatic dollars.
Yeah.
My understanding from the conversation I had with that group is that that same amount could be used for advertising and non-programmatic dollars.
So if we could get a clarification on that, because I'd be ready to move on that quickly too, if we can do that.
I think part of the beauty of that program that we really helped build and sustain for a very long time is that it fulfills such a unique component of the arts and cultural core downtown in that it is all local entertainment, that these are nationally renowned musicians that aren't going to be playing at the Eccles probably, but could be across the street for free.
Who would we have give us the answer to that question?
Well, I know that the director of the Excellence in the Community 501c3 program is happy to meet and has been trying to meet with all of us.
Right.
And could coordinate with our legal team on what the use of those dollars probably are.
Cindy?
Jennifer did have a suggestion, which was that you could, as a board, ask the administration to quickly look at this and put something into the budget amendment, or if they didn't want to recommend it into the budget amendment, they could give you the information to do as a board added item. And then they could coordinate.
Board members, is that a request you would like to make?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay, straw poll that. All in favor of that? Everyone is. Okay.
So the goal is to
Repeat that for us, thanks.
work for a way to use money at the Gallivan in the most appropriate way that enables the concert series to continue. More than that?
Being the
My
right dollars.
understanding was that our dollars didn't go through the Gallivan. They went directly to Excellence in the Community, which is its own 501c3. And that the Gallivan has basically donated the space, the event space, and that we weren't providing funding to the Gallivan for that at all.
Okay. So we need them to figure this.
They're all
out.
at the table together
Okay,
for that dialogue, so
Okay.
I'll let
Thank
them
you.
sort it out.
okay.
Okay, further,
Sure.
yes.
I have a couple of questions in regards to this. Every year, there's a line item in the general fund budget, and I'm trying to remember what it's called, where Salt Lake County puts like $100,000 towards the arts, and so do we as a match. I think there's close to 500,000, 300,000, something like that. Yes. So is this money actually going to be spent now, since it's been sitting there and they've actually selected somebody to implement the project, and that money will be spent instead of just sitting there? Anybody know? Yes.
The latest I know is that the mayor's advisor on arts and culture is working with her counterpart in the county, and that they have issued an RFP for expenditure of that money. I think the council might have approved, I'm having trouble remembering, I think the council might have approved that RFP in the last maybe 6 months or so. So I'm not sure the timing of, when the responses come in and when the money actually gets spent, but the money is planned to be spent. I don't know if you remember, but this year, this past budget year, the city actually did not allocate the $250,000. There were some other sort of last minute needs that needed to be met. So the city didn't contribute to that fund this year, but we did contribute a year early essentially from the county. So they'll expect that we make that appropriation. There's also a funky way with how that, funky is a technical term, of course, the money gets spent, which is that the county and the city councils both have to approve the way that those funds are spent. And so sometimes the way that the funds are spent can be a little bit trickier than sort of typical budget funds. So.
And Jennifer, just to be clear, we skipped a year, but the county came in a year late. So
Yes.
we're at the same,
We're the same total amount.
we're
as the
same
county.
total amount. Okay.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, I
that?
think
About $1 million
Okay.
total now.
I think it's already been awarded. The RFP's already
It
been
might have
yeah,
been, yeah,
to
I haven't
Downtown
heard of-
Presents, which
Yeah,
is an
it
arm of
has
the
been awarded. I'm just wondering if that money was actually being allocated towards them as well.
The county's managing the contract. The contract has been awarded, but I don't know where they are in the process. I'm assuming they have access to the funding now if the contract's been awarded.
Right.
But-
Yeah, typically they would need the money would be released shortly after the contract is awarded, so, yeah.
Maybe a follow-up just to find out where we're at with it.
Okay, further questions on this? Okay, let me propose something. I would look for a motion to adopt the 3 of the 4 items that are ineligible for bonding. The $3 million Central Business District housing, and if we need further discussion on that, we can do that. The citywide housing and the North Temple 10% of tax increment, not the downtown placemaking, but those 3, look for a motion to approve those as part of the CIP today. But do you want to have further conversation about the Central Business District housing? There are
Yes.
questions about that?
Yes.
Okay. Then let's talk about that for a minute, and then I'm going to have a question about bonding and a couple of other questions. But before I receive a motion on that, let's have some conversation then about the Central Business District housing, and that is attachment 2, if you want to take a look at that. Erin, what did you want to ask about that?
Couple of things. So thank you for responding to our questions, although I wasn't very happy with some of the responses. So it sounds like, starting with 2A, how will the funds be coordinated, that they actually aren't coordinated necessarily. Can you reflect on that? Danny, did you write this?
We did write this as staff, and yes, I was involved in that.
Can you reflect on my perception that the answer to A is that this housing won't be coordinated necessarily.
The expenditure of the funds, we have every intention of making sure we coordinate that with HAND or whoever else is appropriately a stakeholder in terms of carrying out the GROW SLC plan as well as the housing strategy of the RDA.
I guess
Purpose
part of my
that
issue
answer, oh,
there
sorry.
is that the growing SLC is an incomplete document that we have not finalized.
And-
And if I may add, we just barely received today, which I haven't had time to review, the
Yes.
RDA's housing proposal. And so a question that comes up for me is, how do those coordinate? And are we looking at funding priorities across departments, or I'm a little concerned the RDA is going this way and HAND might be going this way, and so how is that management happening across departments, and how are we looking at from a city housing perspective? How are we prioritizing
Okay.
things?
Let me answer your question, and then Director Mendenhall, circle back to yours. The purpose of us submitting our housing strategy plan to you now is in anticipation of our discussion at the November meeting. But we wanted to get that in your hands as soon as possible so that you could have that as part of what I understand are your city council meetings regarding the GROW SLC plan priorities and objectives. When you have an opportunity to go through our plan, you're going to see that a lot of our objectives within that plan we have pulled directly from the GROW SLC so that it does coordinate and mirror the priorities, and we are moving together, not in separate directions. As far as priorities for funding, our intention with our plan was to start showing you, along with the GROW SLC, what the bigger picture is in terms of solving the affordable housing crisis within the city right now, as well as aligning both the goals, objectives, and the funding of both the city and the RDA moving forward. So in the GROW SLC, you have components of that plan which align with what should be the city's objectives through their housing department, and then on the RDA side, you have what we're hoping to be the priorities for the funding and the direction of how to spend the $21 million that was allocated. Circling back to your original question, Director Mendenhall, this $3 million was something that we, through this answer, wanted to say that you have the $21 million, which we are going to set the policies and objectives for spending those funds. And this $3 million was something originally anticipated for being targeted towards CBD.
Right.
We wanted to just make it clear in that discussion that they are separate, but the idea is that our goal is to carry out the full objectives and the plans of both the RDA and the city, but target that within the CBD. We didn't necessarily want it to be mixed in the same pot as the $21 million because the mechanism by which this board allocated those funds was different, with different objectives and different goals, as well as different parameters for how we would allocate and approve the use of those funds. So that was the point of this answer. It was not to make it sound like we weren't coordinating those efforts, but that we were somewhat defining what was the ways in which we would release and spend those funds.
If no one has another question on this, can I ask you? So the property you just purchased about an hour and a half ago, are you thinking to use that $3 million for that since it's in the
I would
Central
suspect
Business
in the
District?
near term, I would have a very good use of how to use $3 million to carry out the goals of affordable housing within the Central Business District, yes.
So yes, for the property that we just purchased
Yes.
at noon today. Okay,
Madam Chair,
thank you. Yes,
I
Stan.
do have a question based on a comment I think I heard Danny say that I want to follow up on. You talked about developing those sort of policies and priorities for that $21 million. At the same time, this is part of what I'm starting to have growing concerns about. We're seeing recommendations coming out of the Blue Ribbon Committee to purchase property. We're seeing it's a little bit like a lot of people are seeing a pile of money and they're all getting their fingers in it. And I'm concerned that we don't quite yet have a comprehensive strategy that says over some time frame, and I would say it's probably at least perhaps 5 years. If Melissa were here, she'd say it's a 5-year housing plan. I say it's probably a 10-year housing plan. But over some time frame, that we've had a lot of conversations about how do we best utilize that money.
Right.
And we aren't I don't think we've received the information or the recommendation back that says the best use of that money is to purchase a bunch of land, or the best use of that money might be to help a developer get out of the project at the back end in order to keep the costs down for AMI. And so how are we managing those competing demands for that reserved money for housing?
Yeah, that's the question that we have been addressing. That is a question that we hope to have addressed within our plan. And within that plan, we've looked at that 21 million and essentially allocated between two proposed uses. The first of which is a number of projects that we are requesting direction and decision from the board on whether that is a priority for them to spend part of the 21 million in RDA funds to help carry out those projects. And then the other allocation within our plan is creating what we feel can be a continued funding source that would then be used to align with what is happening in the GROW SLC and the priorities and objectives there. So we've kind of come in and split the difference in terms of our 21 million of projects that we know we can do today and make an impact and want to make a priority and have the board make a decision on those, and if they want to make those a priority and participate. And then an allocation of funds that we can work with over the next short term to midterm with GROW SLC and carrying out projects that we hope to continue to bring forward.
So I guess, Danny, I'm looking for, my concern is that we have competing requests on limited funding, and we don't have the comprehensive plan yet. So I'm struggling with how much gets allocated to land purchase, for example, up front, because that's what everyone's saying is the most urgent thing. We have to buy land.
Right.
And I'm feeling challenged about that because Salt Lake City owns a lot of land already. And so we have to buy land. And then I'm hearing from the Blue Ribbon Commission, well, we have to have a strategy for exiting a developer at the tail end of a project so that they can get out and start their next project, but that's probably a cash sum of some sort. And I haven't seen any information about what that might look like. And so I'm really getting concerned that we're out of money before we look at the comprehensive stabilization of affordability in our plan. And I don't know how do you address that?
Well, as I said, we've addressed it by putting it forward in front of the board. What we want to come to you with is the projects, of which we are asking if this is a priority for the board to go out and start doing these projects and provide affordable housing. That's what we are looking for with our allocation. That allocation and approval would become part of what you defined as the second step, which is that overall conversation with the development community and people who will ultimately do the projects. We would look to use our funds to secure the land and then have that be part of the larger conversation of what the capital stack would be for those projects. So that is aligning those two things that you're hearing of, we got to go buy land and we need to find developers to do it. We would be merging those together by providing the land and then having that discussion of how we would ultimately carry out those projects.
So what I'm hearing from the Blue Ribbon Commission people is that we have to have some sort of cash buyout at the end to get developers out of the project and stabilize the long-term affordability. And I haven't heard any numbers about that.
That was the idea that was discussed and is being looked at in the Blue Ribbon Commission, of having the developers come in and be the ones to buy the land initially, and then we would then be part of the larger capital stack that would take them out. So whether it happens that way or whether it happens that the RDA buys the land and then we work with developers to take on the project and see it through fruition, those are the two proposals that we are working through right now, and that is the basis for which we are going to be coming to you in the very short term on making a decision on.
So, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, Danny, because you're like the newest person around. So you're doing great. You're doing great. But board members, I would suggest that I'm seeing a challenge that we have. It feels like three different entities looking at housing, which is not a bad thing because they all have some role in housing. I'm not convinced they're all coordinating that effort very well. And so I can see Danny coming to us from the perspective of, as an RDA, here's a recommendation, here's what we're going to do. I can see Hand coming to us with a plan saying, well, as Hand, here's a recommendation, and here's what we're going to do. I'm not sure anybody's saying, as a city, here's the recommendation, and here are how we're going to use all of our tools available to us to make sure that we're leveraging and getting the most bang for our buck. And so I don't think that's your role, so I'm not calling
no,
you out on that.
We're part of that. And
But I do think that, and perhaps that's a conversation for, to continue with our housing discussion as we look at that from the council.
I would tell you, we are having those conversations with housing. We're working very closely with them in terms of our plan and how we align those with what their efforts are with the Grow SLC right now. We have coming to you in the short term what we hope to be working with Hand and the Blue Ribbon Commission, coming forth with that first set of projects that we feel are important enough that we want to have the board decide if it's a priority for them and put the funds out for it. In conjunction with that, as part of our discussion in November and the conversations you're having as a council, that is where we're working with Hand to make sure that what they're doing is going to carry through in our plan. And so we are very much working with them and having those discussions so that when you see these documents, you're not feeling like they're separate, but that ours is going to build off and be a part of what the overall Grow SLC plan is.
And so, Danny, I haven't had the opportunity to look at what you transmitted today,
barely got to you.
and I look forward to that. But going forward, for your information, what I'm really going to be interested in is, as an RDA, how does this extend our city goals of affordable housing? Because I don't think the RDA is the solution for affordable housing citywide, but it certainly has a role to play. And I want to make sure that we're having a conversation about best use of RDA funds, best leverage, best opportunity, and I'm a little concerned that to this point that really hasn't been happening.
Yeah. No, and we look forward to having that conversation as you look through our plan and seeing how we can adjust that and make sure that it is accomplishing the goals you see of coordinating with Grow SLC.
Madam
As
Danny,
part of
can
that
I-
larger strategy.
Can I have you just pause for a minute? And David Lipvack, the mayor was here, but she's not. Can you come join us at the table for a minute? And I'm going to ask this question as you come up. I think an overarching concern is we want to know who the point person is that's going to manage the Blue Ribbon Commission ideas, the stuff coming out of Hand, Housing Authority, and from the RDA, and who's the responsible party that will bring these people together and be in charge?
So thank you, Board Member Adams. As you are aware, the administration and council staff have been meeting since I believe early August on developing an approach on the $21 million, the draft of which was sent to you today. We have a couple point individuals. Obviously, we have Danny Waltz with RDA, who's the point person from the RDA. Melissa Jensen has been the point person from Hand.
But who's in charge of all of those people?
And staffing the Blue Ribbon Commission, which is also staffed directly by the mayor. I largely have been working with both RDA and Hand on that coordination between the two.
So the plan that came to us today from the RDA, are we to understand that that is the administration's plan for the $21 million?
Yes, that is the first draft. As I've communicated to staff, we know that it is a draft and that there's conversations to be had with the RDA and the council. There are aspects of the plan that have been reviewed by other stakeholders, particularly the Blue Ribbon Commission and some of the projects that you'll see on the plan. And so, yes.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, did you have a question?
Thank you. David, just because you're here, we have in our attachment to the answer that that Hand and the Housing Authority may not be directly involved in this $3 million. Are you saying that that's not quite accurate?
I didn't bring my computer up with me, so.
No, we
The
wouldn't
board
say that-
asked if the Blue Ribbon Hand or the Housing Authority will be involved in the housing expenditure of the $3 million for CBD, and
Board
it says
Member
that they may
Mendenhall?
not be directly involved.
Just for clarity, is that 2B that you're looking at?
It's 2B. So I'm hearing that they might actually be more directly involved than it sounded like in this memo.
The goal of the 3 million, as I said, was to target CBD. That's somewhat a broader range than what the Blue Ribbon Commission is being charged with in terms of
But
addressing
not
a specific.
hand.
No, and that's what I said in my earlier answers. Depending on what the project is or how we would spend these funds, we would look to coordinate with hand to carry out their objectives. But this is carrying out the RDA's goal of housing within CBD.
I guess that my concern, and Danny, you're doing awesome, okay? Just hang in there with me.
Thanks. No,
That when we talk under 2C about our RDA objectives, such as neighborhood revitalization, leveraging of private funds, and placemaking, are good and well, and we should fulfill those forever. But we need to be working here as though we're in the crisis that we claim to be in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not crisis criteria. This is RDA status quo criteria. And truly, it's great, and I want to keep it. But we are beyond that. Our needs are so much greater than placemaking at this point. And so to hear that it's not the RDA's job to solve the affordable housing crisis, and yet, you know, we have money here that we're trying to start to do that with. We need to be not just checking that we aren't replicating things. We need to be lockstep with hand and with our housing authority in crisis mode. That's where we are. So strategically targeting funds to meet those goals really means that almost any project that comes to us would qualify. And frankly, it's not good enough for me at this point.
Okay.
Further comments on the housing portion?
More, sorry.
Could I
Director
respond?
Lexi Cunningham.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Board Member Mendenhall, I appreciate that. I think that is absolutely the direction of the administration. Hopefully when you have an opportunity to review what was transmitted today, that you'll see that sense of urgency. The Blue Ribbon Commission and Board Member Penfold, I appreciate your point about the coordination. I want you to understand that we are working closely together as an administration, RDA, HAND, the mayor's office, the Blue Ribbon Commission, with Board Member Rogers on it. We have that sense of urgency. That is why the Blue Ribbon Commission has been focused on more of a tactical approach, not a broad strategy, and everything that we're trying to do aligning with the policy of Grow SLC so that we have the foundation that Board Member Penfold is talking about that's driving the decisions. So I just want you to understand that, and hopefully you'll see that reflected in.
All due respect, David, that's for the 21 million. And we're talking about a separate 3 million right here. And what I'm saying is every dollar that we are spending towards housing, in or out of that 21 million, needs to be going through this filter of crisis situation, which doesn't mean knee-jerk, and I don't believe that any of the proposals that I've had the 20 seconds to look at from the transmittal this morning are reacting in that way. But let's not say only our 21 million is going to be addressing our crisis and the other 3 plus.
Well, we know, and obviously we have great appreciation for what we're trying to do with the $21 million, but we also know it's $100 or $150 million problem. And so we know that there's a broader conversation that needs to be had about how we fund and how we move the needle even more so. And so whether it's the 21 plus the 3, we know that there's a broader conversation that needs to happen to really move the needle the way it needs to.
I want to be clear, Danny, that I'm not expecting this 3 million to necessarily address the 40% and below. I think that we have a needs assessment that was completed, and we have an updated reality of what the market is and isn't creating, you know, and that there are other housing types and AMIs that need to be addressed that aren't in the 40%. So I just want to be clear that I'm not trying to scrape that 3 million into the 21 million criteria. I recognize that it's a separate fund.
No, and I appreciate that. And I think what Dave and I are both saying is, yeah, you have that Blue Ribbon Commission that's looking at that tactical approach. And this CBD money, however you want to apply it, can actually look at something beyond just that as well. That's how it was originally intended, was that it wasn't necessarily looking at the same specific goal, but what would be the goals within the CBD project area that this 3 million could go for? And that's why, again, we wanted to separate it and make sure that we could have that conversation.
Board members Adams and Kitchen have in the past talked about, I think many of us have, about our desire to have more family-sized housing downtown, and the lack of public school in the area. And in my meetings this year with Lexi Cunningham of the Salt Lake City School District, she expressed their keen interest on having a conversation with Salt Lake City about the creation of a school downtown. And having those early conversations. So as we look to housing dollars in the CBD, I would like to ask our staff to go have those conversations with the school district and see where their analytics are on the timeline for
You want RDA staff or council staff?
RDA staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, these RDA CBD dollars that we're going to continue to generate. I think that the school district may have a better idea through their required analytics of growth and those, even though I think it's a chicken and the egg, that if you don't have schools nearby, you're probably not going to attract families necessarily to the area. So I'd like us to consider that.
James?
I think I've met with the school board past once, whenever we do that, once a year for the past 4 years, and every time Board Member Penfold brings it up, and we ask him, bring it back, and Aaron, maybe they'll have better luck working with him and bringing that information back. But that's something that we have requested time and time again.
Dan?
I'm hoping this is a little bit of progress, because the response from the school board consistently has been, well, we have Lowell and we're going to put a school in the administration building, and they really have not been able to get their brains around the idea that downtown residents don't want to have to drive their kids to school, and all of those options include a driving model. And they've been having a hard time getting their brain around doing something that doesn't involve driving their kids to school. They have a very suburban way of thinking about how kids get to school, and so I'm hopeful that sounds like some progress.
Yeah,
and I hope that's true.
Superintendent Cunningham said, we've heard basically that the city's interested in having a school downtown, and we really hope you'll talk to us before you talk to charters about fulfilling that elementary need. So.
And Danny, the reason I think it's important to the RDA is because there's no property available for schools downtown. And so they are all, the next education component for the school board is, how do you create a very different kind of school when you're talking about an elementary school for people who live downtown, urbanites basically. And so that's going to be a challenge for them to imagine. We hear it anecdotally, and I want to reference it also in a comment that Board Member Mendenhall made around our expectation of this $3 million RDA money. And so looking at 80% AMIs, that 60 to 80 range, looking at different types of housing, which we've had a lot of feedback that we're really limited, and the RDA has some experience with the Jefferson Walkway and sort of that kind of more urban townhouse, a lot of that work in the Marmalade, and we keep hearing consistently that that's missing in our market, that 3-bedroom family, a new type of family dwelling that's a more urban dwelling. And I think in my mind, that's how the RDA can be really focused about, here's our role in addressing the affordable housing crisis, is we're going to really zero in on this population, because I think, the 40%, which is also critical, comes with a lot of other issues as well. And David, it's one of the concerns I've been having, is like 40% without a conversation of how do we support people at 40% in their housing is probably a setup for failure. Because when we start talking about 40% and below, we're generally talking about some supportive service to keep people stabilized in that housing. And I don't think we've gotten to that point either. We're hearing a lot about how we need to build units at 40%. It's like, well, okay, and then how are we going to make sure that people are equipped to stay in those units at 40% or transition to another unit from there? So I don't think, I don't hear that we're coordinating that well. So I guess I'm looking to you. If we are, we're not hearing about it.
So part of, Board Member Penfold, I appreciate that point. Part of, in the continuum of housing that we're talking about, a little bit separate from 40%, which would probably be inclusive of, is the permanent supportive housing. So we just had a great conversation with board member Mendenhall and Johnston and some of the advocates about that continuum of housing and the difference between permanent supportive housing and mixed income that would include multiple levels of income, including 40%, and the ability to determine beyond just income need, but what are the other type of social service needs that individuals have, and permanent supportive housing being designed to really provide that more wraparound comprehensive services. So the Magnolia, as an example, 60, don't quote me, and Melissa can correct me, I think about 65 units of permanent supportive housing at the old Northwest Pipeline, old police department, that just like Palmer Court, not as big, but just like Palmer Court, where you have individuals who have that income need, but also have the support services need. So in that continuum of housing, in some way, we're separating that in terms of talking about what the permanent supportive housing needs are in our community among our population, and individuals that may have the income need, but would be able to succeed in a mixed income housing.
And I appreciate the permanent supportive housing when you talk about 40% below, 20%, that sort of thing. I think there's a whole critical component of services attached to that, which is going to require county and state involvement. But I guess my experience with even at 40%, that it's not uncommon to deal with a situation where there's a crisis in the life of someone who's living at 40% that puts their risk of losing even their 40% pretty significant. And I don't think it's permanent supportive. I think it's access to some type of one-time crisis management, maybe a longer-term sort of thing. And frankly, I'm not sure we have that in our market, and I'm pretty concerned that we set ourselves up for some pretty significant failure if we don't address that when we start talking about what type of support should we be looking to provide to people who are living at the 40% AMI units we're going to provide for them. And I don't think it's okay just to say, oh, we're going to move this population out of the shelter, working homeless men, for example, because they're 40%, can't do first and last, but we just hope they do okay over in this unit we build for them somewhere. I think we have a responsibility to be more aware of how we're going to stabilize that housing.
Absolutely.
Further questions on housing?
Madam Chair, may I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
Was that, just so we have clear direction, was that an official straw poll on RDA staff reaching out to the school district and coming back with that information?
We didn't take a straw poll on it, but we will do that. Those in favor of having them reach out to the school district about school property, thumbs up. It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Danny, my reservation with just doing that by straw poll is that we've had a lot of conversations about how important it's going to be as we see people moving into the downtown core, because we are seeing a demand in the core right now. The concern, I think, is as soon as people decide they want to have families, they're faced with moving back out. And so it's tied to that conversation of long-term stability and housing options in the urban core.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Andrew.
One question for David, I guess, to lead off. I think you're right. I think in this context, though, and you said very clear we're not putting RDA on the spot here, but we sort of are because this is their conversation about housing. My question is back to David again about if you're the point person coordinating. Is that what I heard, David?
I'm doing my best to coordinate between all the agencies, yes.
Okay. That would be my bigger concern, not just RDA, is that we've asked the RDA to do very, very specific things with specific properties. We've asked them to do it in RDA zones, right, or certain pots of money, and we need somebody else outside of RDA to help organize their role versus somebody else's role versus another role, coordinate them together, and then also add in what Stan's talking about, which is if right now most Medicaid folks are on this end of the valley. And we know that, and we're going to build housing for 40% and below AMI. With the information we have right now, we know we're short on units for that. If we build more units, do we attract more of them here, and does the need go up or down? How do we monitor that? And this is a long-term discussion because we're doing it in a sort of a vacuum right now with affordable housing. We need to do it, but that discussion needs to be much broader and of a longer term than this. And so I would hope, outside of the RDA's staff, excuse me, that we would be able to take that going forward and figure out a more real clear way, not just sort of saying, hopefully you'll take care of it for the foreseeable future, but have it organized who's going to be the point person to coordinate everything we have, because we're going to potentially have 21 million plus 3 plus who knows what else if we talk about this to allocate, and having a very deliberate long-term strategy would be helpful for us. And I think it will also help for us in these briefings to be able to clear and say, who do we talk to?
Right.
Because right now we are putting everyone on the spot individually and saying, well, who's coordinating what and who's in charge, and there's not really. I mean,
Well, Board Member Johnson, let me, if I can respond to that. Right now, when we talk about affordable housing, right now we're talking about it in the context of the $21 million and RDA really taking the leadership and working with the administration with hand in the draft that was transmitted today, and I apologize, and council staff in our working group. When we talk about the broader conversation, and I will say that much like homelessness and working with individuals and families experiencing homelessness, I have often found my role in the mayor's office to help coordinate efforts where the expertise lies, whether that's within the administration, in our departments and divisions, and with the community. And some of that has fallen, is the way I look at my role with the housing as well. When we talk about growing SLC and the broader conversation that we are having and will continue to have about how we meet the housing needs in our community, whether that's, we talk specifically affordable housing and other policy and gaps identified in growing SLC, and the issues that Board Member Penfold is raising around providing the right stabilization, which will include a lot of partnership with the community. I want to be really clear that on a broader context, the housing conversation is in the very capable hands of HAND and community and neighborhoods in terms of coordinating. It's almost, in some ways, it's almost, I'm a visual person, so I'm trying to picture this in my mind. It's almost, and I'm totally talking off the top of my head, and so I'm going to apologize now for anything I get wrong. It's almost a flip. Right now, when we're talking about the 21 million, we have RDA kind of leading out that conversation because of the source of funding. But when we talk about that broader housing conversation, HAND kind of, it flips a little bit, and RDA is a critical part of that affordable housing conversation, but they're also they're so much bigger than affordable housing, right? And so I want to be very clear what that conversation looks like for the administration from a broader perspective.
so to be clear from our end of things, so we're not muddying the waters more, HAND is the point on housing and should be coordinated. Everything that we do for housing for the city, whether RDA or anything else in the city budget, should be touching HAND.
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. And that is how we're approaching the $21 million, and that is how we're approaching growing SLC.
Okay. The second piece that's related to this, do we have a clear, an accurate inventory of all of our RDA properties, whether in the CBD or citywide?
Are you speaking available properties?
Just city properties, period.
We do have that.
We do.
Clear one?
And we have a regular report that we give in terms of RDA properties and what the status is. And I think
Okay.
we're coming up on that.
I think just recently we had
We saw-
something come up where we
Correct.
actually identified parcels that we
Mhm.
could build on
Yeah.
and parcels that we own, whether it's, an alleyway or that type of.
So I just want to make clear on that piece as we move forward, because our biggest asset, probably not the 21 million, is probably going to be property we have, both the RDA and the city. Okay. I think that's all for this particular piece, but I have more for later, so.
So,
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a request, and it would be a request from you as the chair, as well as the chair of the Salt Lake City Council. I thought that we had a great fact-finding night when we brought in all the different individuals and we talked about economic development or when we talked about housing. But I think for the city, the administration as well as the council, it would be a huge added benefit for us to do a fact-finding night on different types of developments that we've never seen in the city, whether it's shipping containers or, you know, let's bring someone in that has done a tent city or something similar to that, and let's really start talking about these questions at a city level, because I don't think we've ever done it before. But if we bring in developers that have done these in successful areas, I think that we're going to have probably the best opportunity nationwide to actually address the real issue at hand, and that's making it affordable and providing that affordable housing stock. Whether we're doing it or whether we're contracting it out, we get the different types of developments, have them come in, we ask questions, staff asks questions, we do that fact-finding night, and I think that ends up being a really tremendous thing for Salt Lake City in identifying different types of developments.
Okay, noted. Thank you. Further questions on this? I'm pleased to hear that you are acting as the point person. You need to know, I have felt like there are entities, at least 3 entities going in different directions, not all in the same general direction, but on different tracks. So I'm pleased to hear someone's trying to coordinate between the RDA and HAND and the Blue Ribbon Commission and probably the 4th entity is the Housing Authority. And I would say look to the Housing Authority for some other ideas. I had the opportunity to spend time with them, seeing the properties they own, and it was a variety across the spectrum, everything from townhomes to apartments to the facility on the campus of the Veterans Administration. And I think that would be good. But my sense has been it didn't feel like anyone was in charge, that everyone was siloed doing their own thing. So I'm pleased to hear that that's going on. Okay, anything further than Andrew?
Just to reiterate, I want to make sure we're clear though, because this is going to keep coming up. HAND is being said they're the point.
Yeah.
David Litvak is coordinating, but he's saying very clearly HAND. So whether Blue Ribbon Commission or RDA or anything else that comes forward, that's the focus.
Goes through HAND. Is that correct?
Just want to make sure I'm clear on this.
The broader housing conversation.
Yeah.
But we have to separate out the $21 million in terms of the RDA funding and what the RDA put forward, that again, the transmittal that you received today. And let me also be very clear. David Litvak is an expert in nothing. And so I rely extremely heavily on the experts that we have within our departments and divisions who are really the experts in moving us towards what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
I wish we had a housing czar in the city. And I think it would need to be someone who is an expert in this issue.
I would say, I appreciate that, but I would say that when we look at what we have right now with HAND and community and neighborhoods and the development of growing SLC, I think we have a great deal of expertise.
I don't think it means a new person. I mean that it would be someone like Melissa Jensen or Mike Ackerlow who have an incredible amount of experience and understanding of our city resources and knowledge of the whole playing field, who by the term czar, I mean that in crisis mode, sometimes we appoint czars to help to be that point person who mostly who has the authority, who's appointed to have the authority to convene and speak with the cohesive voice. And I think it requires an expert level understanding of all that they're speaking to. So I think that the mayor should appoint a housing czar to speak on behalf of these silos.
Okay. Anything further on housing with this? Because we're going to have housing again. Our 20-minute conversation, we are at 50 minutes. But this is really important. It's not anything we want to rush through. So does anyone like to make a motion about what we want to do, or adopting some or all or none of the CIP? Earlier I mentioned perhaps we adopt some of the CIP items that are not bond eligible and leave the bond eligible ones aside until we get more on that. And while you're thinking about this, I have a question. Who sets the rules about what is bond eligible? Where does that come from? Is it state law? Is it banking personnel? Who determines what is bond what makes it bond eligible?
No.
Our own Jennifer Bruno decides.
No, thankfully I don't. I think the answer is a little bit layered. It depends on the type of bond first. And so I think the first layer is a taxable bond or a tax-exempt bond. Typically in the city, we only discuss tax-exempt bonds because they're lower interest rate and a better, quote-unquote deal for taxpayers. And so that takes off a whole bunch of things on the table that would otherwise be on the table if we were doing taxable bonds. So, for example, in the case of the Eccles Theater, a portion of that is a taxable bond, and that opened up a whole bunch of options that would not have been eligible to be bondable, so to speak, if they were tax exempt. And so tax exempt are things like government-owned facilities, so usually there's an ownership interest from the government for tax exempt. But depending on what you want to pay for, there's a whole myriad of ways that can be accomplished. It's sort of a chicken and egg thing. Most of the time, things that don't have a very long lifespan are not bond eligible, just because the bondholder, whether it's taxable or tax exempt, doesn't have anything to sort of recall on if you default. So,
Okay, thank you. And Cindy Gush Jensen, you also said you had a comment that I meant to call on you prior to my question.
Well,
about
I'm
that.
just trying to tie the link between this RDA budget conversation and the housing policy conversation that you have scheduled later on your agenda, and your special RDA meeting that you have at 5 o'clock. One of the things that you can do instead of voting up or down right now whether you want to appropriate the $3 million for housing in the downtown is that you could leave that question open, defer that for a vote later this afternoon when you have had a more complete chance to talk this through. So that's one thought. There is one other item on this budget opening that we wanted to give you some new information on. And so we can do that. We just didn't want you to leave that before. And then as I'm listening to what you're saying, I'm realizing that on housing, that the RDA hand and the blue ribbon each has a different charge. And so that's part of why we are feeling like there's confusion. So the 1,000 units of 40% AMI on the ground in a specified time frame, my understanding is that is the charge of the Blue Ribbon Committee, and HAND is facilitating that. The RDA still has they have the funding and they have their regular responsibilities as well, so they're trying to keep those responsibilities in context with that. What I don't know how we are incorporating is the things that the council has said, like you want everything to be mixed income. You want equal division of mixed and market on east side and west side. You want affordable housing spread throughout the city. You want to have some emphasis on areas of opportunity. So hopefully when we get into the housing conversation with the council hats on, we can get some clarity on some of those things, and that might help us to, as staff, to understand how these pieces fit together. Because right now, as we're trying to do our work, we are still struggling with that confusion. So, but can we have Ben tell you the other information item and Danny may have some information on it too.
So the next item is an update on the 900 South utility undergrounding. The board may remember you updated the funding contingencies as part of the annual budget, and the update was for the RDA staff to work with Rocky Mountain Power to evaluate alternatives to the undergrounding and report back to the board with those alternatives. RDA staff has spoken with Rocky Mountain Power, and they have a quote of $58,000, and this is to perform two things. The first is to have a contract-ready cost estimate for actually burying the power lines. And the second is to analyze the alternatives to the utility undergrounding.
Do you have a cost distinction on those?
The first, the construction level estimate for the undergrounding is $47,000, and then it's $11,000 for the alternatives analysis.
And
It's actually, had an update. It's 8,000 for the alternatives analysis and 50 for the undergrounding finalization of those costs.
Okay.
And
And-
that's contract ready, right?
That's
50
making it contract
50,000.
ready.
and if we go forward with the undergrounding, we'll have to do the 50,000 regardless. Is that accurate?
Correct.
That is something we would have to do in order to underground the power.
Correct.
Okay.
And also to remind the board that you appropriated the funding for the utility undergrounding back in March. It was the $2.29 million that's sitting waiting for these funding contingencies before it's released.
But we don't know that that's actually sufficient or more than enough to cover the costs.
Correct.
We don't know either of those things. Okay.
So we have the $8,000 question to be partly resolved, what the other options are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll know that. So, board members, I would straw poll the proposition that we go ahead and fund that, or confirm, we've already funded it, confirm that we want that study done for the $8,000 of what the options are.
I would also propose that we do the $50,000 as well, because if we go with an underground burial, we'll have to do that. And frankly, I'd like to know what those costs actually are, because we've been talking a lot about a lot of hypothetical numbers in this conversation, and it would be nice to have a firm cost estimate on that.
Okay, I thought we had already approved the 50, but let's just let the 58,000.
It's a little peculiar because you've approved both. So this was RDA staff confirming, now that they know what the cost is, they're confirming with you, do you want to do this?
And so, Madam Chair, even if we are duplicating what we've already done, I would personally like to confirm that we are willing to spend the $50,000 on the cost estimate and the $8,000 on options alternatives.
Okay, any further discussion on that? Okay, all in favor of that 58,000 being spent that way? It is unanimous. Thank you very much. Okay, very good. And I also wanted to note that in answer to a number of our questions, you were, the RDA staff was very cordial in saying they're happy to facilitate conversations, particularly about whether things are impact fee eligible and about whether the council staff would do it or not. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's really an administrative function to identify if stuff is impact fee eligible. So while you generously offered it to us, I think it's your role.
Sounds good.
And if I'm wrong, somebody correct me. But
No,
I
that
think
seems appropriate.
that's-
And actually, the most recent council city CIP process was getting really good at identifying the impact fees as part of that process. So I'm thinking we can duplicate that. I'm hoping we can duplicate that at the RDA level as well. So whatever they're doing on the city side, it really worked well this year, I think, for evaluating those impact fees in the process. It was incredibly helpful
Yeah,
this
and
year.
I would request just that anytime you bring us a request for something, always do that impact fee analysis so we know if it's eligible or not, so we don't have to wait and then have us say, can you find out if it's impact fee eligible?
We are more than happy
Is that okay?
to be the lead on always providing information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there further discussion on the RDA CIP? I am thinking that we will follow Cindy's lead and hold off on taking a vote on the parts of that until we have our additional conversation. Ben, did you have something else to add?
I was just going to say, of the 4 projects that are likely ineligible for bonding, 2 of them are legally required, and
Right.
I don't think they'd be impacted by the bonding discussion.
Okay, so why don't I look for a motion to approve the 2 that we're legally obligated to do.
And I'm sorry, which ones are you talking about?
This is the
depot?
bottom of page 1.
Right.
It's the citywide housing and the North Temple 10% of tax increment for a future school fund.
So is there a motion to approve the citywide housing and the North Temple 10% tax increment?
So made.
Second.
Okay, then those two are a done deal.
Oh, we have to vote.
Yeah, okay, yes, so moved, sorry. That would be good. Any further discussion on those two? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Do I need to roll call that? I'm okay, all right. It is unanimous, and we have adopted those two parts of the RDA CIP budget. All right, now, moving on to item B3, tax increment reimbursement policy follow-up. And joining us at the table would be Danny Walls, Jill Wilkinson-Smith, and from the council staff, Allison Rowland. Thank you, Ben.
All right.
And thank you, Ed. All right, Allison, do you want to walk us through this?
Sure. Thank you, Director Adams. As you may remember from the September meeting, the RDA board reviewed a draft of the RDA's tax increment reimbursement program policy resolution and focused specifically on the single property business retention tool, took a number of straw polls. So this is the RDA coming back to present what they came up with in order to comply with those straw polls. These include, for example, that final approval authority for one of these single property business retention areas rests with the board, that there's an annual application limit of 4 per calendar year, that the capital expenditure requirement of 12 million refers to private capital. They've defined job creation metrics and job retention metrics. The standard participation rate for the city's increment is set at 70% with a total maximum increase based on the economic and public benefit incentives of 20%, so that's 5% per criterion that is fulfilled. A third-party financial analysis is required. The comprehensive information about final project terms will be transmitted to the board prior to the public hearing. Reporting requirements and recapture provisions are included. A public information sheet will be produced by the RDA staff, and the flow chart has been included in the resolution. So those are the main changes that they made. And then there are a number of policy questions which Madam Chair may or may not want us to go through.
All right, I would like us to be able to have those policy discussions. What I'm looking for today, if we can get there, is to adopt, perhaps with the following changes. If there are some things, I know there are a couple things that have been discussed, just wanting to tweak with this a little bit, but let's go ahead and have the policy discussion about this.
Madam Chair, I have
Yes,
a couple
James.
questions. I guess the first one would be on item 3, issues at a glance. The capital expenditure requirement of 12 million refers to private capital. Does that include the asset itself, or is that just new money coming in?
Talking in terms of the staff, the council staff report, item 3,
Yeah.
the third-party review for the
No,
Land acquisition?
the capital expenditure requirement of 12 million refers to private capital. Is that asset-based, or are you talking just,
Okay, sorry, I was on the back page.
No, you're
The
fine.
other number 3.
yeah,
Yes, the 12 million is private capital.
it's private capital, so it could be asset-based.
It could have other funding as part of their project, but a minimum of 12 million has to come from private capital.
Okay. The other question I had, for example, I guess it's a two-part question. If the owner of the property leases the building to a tenant, right, can the owner of the building come and apply for this, for the tax increment reimbursement?
Yes.
So can the lessee, can they do it as well, come and apply if they show a ground lease for X amount of
I
years?
believe we've structured it to where the lessee and the owner can apply.
Okay, great, thank you. Can we just verify that?
Yeah, I will verify that.
Further questions? Stan?
So Danny, can you talk to me a little bit about, I think the third-party review helps protect us a little bit from people making an application to this process because they overpaid for their property, so inflated property value. But how do we look at ensuring that we're not providing a escape for someone who's overpaid for property?
That would be part of our third-party verification. We do that as part of any gaps analysis. We review and figure out what we feel the market rate would be for the property.
So the third party would do a market rate assessment, and so that just gets excluded from their application process numbers. So
Exactly.
okay. Another question I have is one of the criteria we have for the single property is rather than permanent job creation, we have significant job creation. So can you just talk to me how you make that distinction? And we also talk about significant wage creation. So
Right. We have within the policy, we define it as, I'm trying to figure out where that is. I apologize. I'm looking through the staff. Thank you, Jill. Yes, so we have the minimum creation of one full-time permanent job as per every 50,000 of eligible increment. So that would be the standard, and then significant would be over and above that.
I'm sorry to call you out, Dan. I should be calling Jill out
Yeah.
on this. So.
No,
I'm sorry. We just got in such a habit in the previous briefing of talking to you.
More
so.
succinct answers than I do.
So it's like
Yeah.
it's truly baptism by fire. You need to answer every single RDA question.
So they have to meet the minimum eligible, and then over and above that, we would have to determine the significance.
So one of the concerns I've always had about this program is that if we look at areas where this potentially could implement it, in particular in new areas of the city like the Northwest Quadrant, I have a concern, and I know there are other things happening out there, but I have a concern about this idea of a potentially pretty significant increase to a facility that could put some significant demands on our infrastructure, and we're deferring the revenue that would potentially pay for some of that infrastructure off 20 years.
Right.
So, and a sort of a classic example is a large manufacturing plant that came in. Let's be optimistic and say it had 1,000, really well-paying jobs, but it's sort of in a remote area, not accessible by transit. We have poor road infrastructure out there, and now we're faced with balancing how do we do our road infrastructure when we're deferring the tax increment that pays for that infrastructure. So how have you analyzed that sort of deferment and the benefit over our need for infrastructure?
So the first part of the answer to that is, first and foremost, we have to keep in mind that the city will continue to get the base value. So anything you're getting today, you will continue to get. To the extent that you do a development that is perceived as putting an impact or a burden on the existing resources, keep in mind that we're only going up to 90% of the city's participation, so you would get that 10% to help offset those costs.
So I'm a little concerned about that because 10% basically gets sucked up in administration generally. So
No, that's.
do you feel comfortable that 10% is sufficient? And I sort of, I'm sorry to take you to the worst case scenario, but if we've got 100 new jobs and every one of those people drives, or 1,000 new jobs and every one of those people drives a car out to this new facility, there's some infrastructure impact that I'm not sure 10% would recover.
And you're absolutely right. 10% may not cover it, and so from there you would then look at, okay, is this project going to then spur additional development that does generate revenue for the city that isn't part of this? And then as your final backstop, you have the option of not going up to that 90%. So everything that we're proposing here is subject to negotiation with the agency, as through the developer, to where the extent that if the city felt that it was a project that did provide a significant enough impact, you could retain more than that 10% as part of what your offer is.
And so, Danny, as part of your new responsibility here, and Jill chime in too, one of the ongoing sort of, I think, competing value issues in any tax increment funding, in particular around job creation, has been the city typically doesn't see any revenue for infrastructure and health and safety through job salary revenue. That certainly benefits the state. It's an income tax base. I get that. I'm not saying we shouldn't create jobs, but it's challenging because of our tax structure to say, how are we going to support that? Because I can make a pretty safe assumption that most of those high-paying employees aren't going to be able to find housing in Salt Lake City. So we're not capturing the property tax side of it somewhere else. So how do you evaluate that balance?
We evaluate it first and foremost from the property tax that comes off this specific project, and secondary, what secondary tax increment and projection and property tax value would be thrown off by doing these projects in and around that. So, for example, if we're looking at a project that has an infrastructure expense within it, we can look at whether that infrastructure will also be supportive and encourage development around it, which then at that point would go straight to the city.
Can I piggyback on that, Madam Chair? The adaptations you made to our last discussion are great.
Thank you.
And I think I really appreciate that the board will have the final authority and have an authority throughout the process to stop any particular application for any reason. And what I think I'll be looking for in terms of that deferred justification that we will be making essentially, or choose not to make on each project, is particularly on the really big ones where we're talking about really a significant impact on surrounding infrastructure, for example, that I will be looking for an analysis of what that deferred cost is in an estimate fashion in working with transportation or public utilities, even public safety perhaps, depending on the place and the type of work and how many people. And also an analysis of how the impact fees of their cost of expansion will or will not be able to be used to address those deferred needs, okay? So just a heads up, I can see on the smaller scale that it's kind of comes out in the wash and right, it'll spur other development and we can increase property tax.
And it's a great tool to have a development come in and potentially even build some of that needed infrastructure as we look to develop parts of the city. And so you can actually use this tool to have the developer pick up a cost of that the city is otherwise not able to do, and then reimburse the developer for a portion of that. And so you get the benefit and you defer the costs until it actually generates the increment.
I wonder on the larger hypothetical projects where they could come to us, and I'm talking now about the economic and public benefit incentives and how they can get up to a maximum of a 20% increase, taking it to the 90% from the 70% we start at. Let's say that they come to us and they're fulfilling, more than 5 of them. They're fulfilling essentially 30% of public benefit. And we decide, though, that it would be a significant impact such that we can't afford to give up that much in the general fund to offset it.
You could do that.
Hypothetically. I could see where there's significant pressure on you and your staff and on the situation for us to approve it because of the ample public benefit of their investment. But the cost really falls more onto the general fund and the council deliberations through every single budget for the next 20 years of the life of the building.
Well, and that's what's nice about the nature of the project or the program is that you actually have to prove it on both the city council and the RDA side. And so you have that ability to have that conversation sitting as the city council and deciding that you don't want to create the project area at all. And so you can look at that as a way of saying if it represents that significant of an impact, you don't have to do it. And if it represents a significant enough impact to where you don't want to go up to that 90%, you have the ability to make an offer of what you are willing to go up to and work with the developer on whether they're still interested in doing that.
So would it be on the RDA staff, or would it be incumbent on other departments then that may be impacted by certain types of development to provide us with the analysis so that we could adequately say this cost, this deferred cost, this impact cost, whatever it is is more than we're going to benefit. You know, we need numbers in order to do that. So who do you see making that analysis?
That would be on the RDA staff, and we would be able to work through whether that would be part of the third-party verification that we would look at through an independent source, or it would be on part of the RDA staff to work with whoever in the city would be able to provide that information and come back to you as the board and provide that. Keep in mind that not only are we going to do a third-party verification, but we're also going to take it through the RDA Finance Committee. And so those conversations with other city departments could just as easily be part of that overall Finance Committee recommendation. And with direction from the board that that is a significant enough concern, we would be charged with bringing you that information to make that decision.
Because the third party in the RDA Finance Committee aren't necessarily looking at infrastructure, right? They're looking at the
Right.
financing of the project itself and the gap.
Well, and it depends. I mean, they're not necessarily looking at it from a potential cost burden on the city.
Right.
They're looking at it as a needs assessment and defining
On
the
the project
But
proposal.
we can certainly have as part of that scope, either through the third party or our own finance committee. If there is a project that we feel, or I should say as the board feels, provides that significant of enough impact, we could get direction from you early on in those small working group meetings and beyond, that is something you want us as staff to come back and address as part of the decision.
So I like this direction, and I feel like I'd actually prefer that to be built into the policy. And I understand then we'd have to create some sort of a threshold, or perhaps it's part of the questioning of our first interface, whether it's in the small group meetings, or I'm not sure when in the timeline you propose that happen, but I'd love to put that into the policy somewhere, that there is an analysis or consideration.
I actually think it's in there already with the creation of the project area in whole. We are required by state statute that we have to provide that public benefit analysis. And as we are doing with our new project area creation, we are looking at that as what the impact and the benefit would be to every taxing entity. And so it's very easy for us to say that as part of that public benefit analysis, you want that to also address if there's costs that the city is going to have to absorb. I mean, I think that's within that scope already. I'm not sure
Okay,
we
if you
would need
could
additional
maybe
language on that.
Just refer me to the section if you can, or if someone can come back and refer me
Yeah,
to
I
that
mean,
section. Thank you.
It's just part of what statutorily we are required to do to set up a project area, and it's one of the items that we have to give information on, and it's the public benefit analysis.
But I'm talking about public cost, not benefit analysis, really.
Right, but that's provided on behalf of the taxing entities. For you to opt into a project area, it is very easy for you to say as a city, we want that as a component of our public benefit analysis. And I think we can take that direction as staff and make sure that as we bring these to you, that information is included.
Cindy Guest Jensen.
Just, what Danny is saying is totally correct, but what council member or board member Mendenhall is saying is that so that we have this clarity
Right.
of expectation, we need to have some language that is put together that spells that out, because we do currently have a public benefit study on the council agenda right now that does not address any downsides. It only addresses upsides, and traditionally they do just address upsides. So if we're deviating from that, it might be just nice to have it in writing.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Thank you.
And we could, I recognize there's a goal of getting this developed, or
Right.
adopted today. You could do a tentative with the understanding that you'd come back with that language. There are about 3 other things in here that,
A tentative adoption
Yeah.
with an understanding that we would come back at our next meeting perhaps, and
to finalize the language from that and whatever others you might choose out of the menu that Allison has listed.
yes.
Great. James?
Aaron brings up a great point. For me, I would, developers are gonna see what the requirements are, whether it's 80% or 90%. For me, if we set a great target at 80% and let them come back with something in addition, better, like what we say here, incentives. I mean, in order to actual, you have to have it a harder goal at 80% and then have, I really think that's the way to do it. And that's why I think it's on there, is it was suggested that we go 80%, have them come back with that opportunity. Help me understand why you see 90% as being effective. I don't see it as
Yeah.
really as a great of a bargaining tool as we can to, give them an additional 10% to make it happen.
We're at 70. Are we at 70 now, though?
You're at 70 with the ability to go up to 90 if they
Right.
meet those criteria at 5% each.
I'm fine with 70 with a cap at 80, having it come back, or, 90, but I just don't feel like setting it at that,
So are you suggesting that we go with 80 with a cap at 90, or?
70 and have a cap at 80 or 85. I really do.
Yeah.
I just think it's much more, it's easier for us to negotiate that way than saying right off the bat, 80% you can come back and we'll give you this. Make it a little bit harder. They're gonna do the deal. That's just, now, as a developer, if you say, I'm gonna get X amount of money if I do this or that, and then you come back and say, but if we do this, we can have this additional stuff as well. It just, I'm really ruining myself here. As a developer, I'm not a developer, but if you give it all at once, they're going to take it all at once. It's not going to give us any opportunity to negotiate. That's just where I stand.
Can I just ask a question for clarification? Given that we're talking to developers right now about this program, and so if we're talking about a tentative approval with this built in, I want to make sure that we are able to continue those conversations. Are you thinking that we would have the 70% base, they could earn up to 80% if they meet 2 of those criteria? Would they get to that additional 90% by meeting those criteria as well, but those would just be subject to the board, or would it be something over and above those criteria that they
I
would
think
have to
if they're willing to
justify?
go above and beyond, we're more than willing to do that if they're willing to do it. But I say we set it hard and a little bit lower and make them work for it.
Okay, so 2% gets you to 80, I mean, 2 of the criteria gets you to 80%, and then if you go above and beyond that, they can get there, but that additional 10% is just subject to board
Right.
approval.
I'm really
Okay.
comfortable with that.
James,
I
can
ju-
I
I just want to
jump
make sure
on?
we had
Yeah.
that proposed correctly.
I just want to recognize that we have, 10 criteria there? No, 9? From sustainability to unique construction or tenant improvements. I think we'd actually like them to achieve all of those things. Why wouldn't we take that 20% wiggle room and divide it by 9 and say each one could be 2.5%?
Some are going to be harder to do than others.
I would
but-
argue that not every project
Okay, then
is
are there
capable.
2 tiers of
Or they're
percentages?
more than that. You set a base at, 65 and say, these are what we'd like to see happen. And we'll give you X amount of credit for it.
I would just love to be able to achieve all of the things we wish that they would achieve and not cut them off at the knees.
So, Jill, can you remind me, when we did a similar incentive program for interest rate reductions for our loan program?
Right.
And did we say if you hit this criteria, you get 0.5%, this one you get, because I sort of remember that's how we did it in the loan program. It's like
Right.
the more you hit, the more it dropped.
Correct.
I'm just throwing it out there to say if that's what we want to consider here.
4.
Up to 4, yeah. And so we have a little more flexibility here because we were concerned about where our rate was based to the market. But because it can be pretty enticing if you hit those 4 because we're already tied to market. So you get 4, it's not 4 points, but you get some decrease by a factor of 4. So I'm wondering if that's a consideration we want to put on this, that we tie that incentive to a number of criteria you hit, and maybe that's the way to. I don't know. I guess I would like some feedback.
That's how
on
we've tried to do this. We tried to model this as the same as the loan program, and we set it up to where obviously as you hit these, you get consideration 5% for each. I would be concerned with getting too specific on how many they have to hit. I mean, if we're truly talking about an industrial warehouse that's going to be tilt-up concrete, you're never going to get historic preservation. You're never going to get public amenities. You're never going to get even great
you
urban
could-
design.
But you
know?
could get public amenities if they were going to build out a bus bench that had X, Y, and Z attached to it, right?
Well, and I mean, yeah, you could. I tend to think of public amenities as, something a little bit more. But
Right, of course.
My point is exactly this conversation, is I would prefer a staff to give us some flexibility to address that. You will ultimately have the final approval of which ones they do or do not accomplish and achieve. And it's really hard if we start looking at detailing it too specific, because that is very difficult as we start talking to these people about economic development to try to get that. And I would just simply ask that we err on the side of giving us more flexibility, a box within which we can operate, and then have us make the case to you as the board when we start bringing these to you.
Okay, further conversation on that?
Yeah, I have something to add a little
Derek.
bit. So Thank you, Danny and staff, for putting the work into this. I think we have a pretty workable plan here, and I think, you know, we've made good progress in this work session. But I'd like to talk about other potential uses of this tool. What we've laid out here is the case for economic development and how we can use the redevelopment agency and tax increment in particular to achieve our economic development goals. But last week I had the opportunity to sit down with Melissa Jensen and Sean Murphy from Housing and Neighborhood Development, along with Nick from Planning and a few of our staff members, and we were talking about the growing SLC plan and ways that we could move our housing goals along a little bit further. And in that plan, if you're interested in looking it up yourself, goal 2.2.2 talks about a number of potential statutory changes or citywide policy that we may want to look at. And one of them was a tax abatement for affordable housing. And I realize that we're not calling this TI reimbursement policy tax abatement, but it effectively serves the same purpose. And so I've had the opportunity to speak with Danny and RDA staff yesterday as well as today about coming back to us with some additional information and a proposal that would, in the same way this has addressed economic development, we could have a tax increment, single parcel, single property tax increment reimbursement policy for affordable housing as well. And so I actually would appreciate a straw poll from this body to find out if that's an interest, if it's just my interest or if that's shared among this body as well.
Before we straw poll, I have a question. Is there anything in the current proposal that would prevent a $12 million housing expansion project from accessing this?
The way the single property CRA process is geared right now, it's targeted towards economic development, job retention, and growth of businesses staying within Salt Lake City. So I think we would need to probably have a third option for housing that then involves its own objectives and criteria that housing developments would have to meet.
What do you think?
Okay.
Great idea.
Do you want to propose how you'd word the straw poll?
It's simple. Does the Board of Directors of the Redevelopment Agency support the staff coming back to us in the November meeting with a proposed plan for affordable housing development, tax increment reimbursement policy for affordable housing?
Or as soon as possible?
I was going to ask maybe not November because that really only gives us 1 week.
As soon as possible, yes. Yeah.
And can I say, I feel like we could adopt this knowing we could come back and modify it in the future.
I'm imagining this to be an addendum or
Right.
amendment.
So-
Or
Okay.
it sounds like it might be an entirely separate program, so
Yeah,
that would
so-
be, which would be fine.
Right, okay. Further questions? Then I have a couple. Yeah, oh, yeah, yes, go ahead, sorry. Straw poll.
Straw poll.
Okay,
Was my question clear? Do we support that, staff putting that effort?
Into it, go ahead.
What gets
Discussion?
bumped? Anything get bumped if we ask that?
Does anything get bumped in terms of not being able to do something
Workload
else?
and everything else you're doing?
No, I think it would just be a matter of kind of taking what we've done and crafting it. And there would be some questions we'd probably ask of the board in terms of direction for goals and objectives, but we can put that together fairly easily. It's just,
Yeah, and the other thing is that we also have that for project limit per year.
Per
So
year, right.
may want to discuss whether or not it would be for economic development projects and for housing projects.
so we can put that together with minimal stress.
Great
Erin?
idea. Love this idea.
Okay. Those in favor of this proposal? Okay, it is unanimous. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, I would like to, nobody else?
Well-
Andrew?
Just a question on recapturing.
Okay.
How does that process work, and are we willing to do it? Have we done it in other areas?
In terms of recapturing, what specifically are you talking about?
The tax increment if they don't live up to certain conditions.
Oh,
and the objective,
yes,
the
we-
targets essentially, and what. how
We
often
have
do review it?
clawback provisions within the reimbursement agreement to where they will have annual requirements that they have to meet on an ongoing basis that they will then have to verify prior to us distributing their reimbursement.
So how do they verify certain things? Because we always have self-reporting on these things, number of jobs created, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Do we have the ability to go out and actually do that?
Yeah, we usually
Enforcement,
write
right?
within the agreement that if they obviously don't cooperate or they have concerns with us doing that, we could have a third party verify that. Typically, in terms of number of jobs or job wages, we give them the opportunity to have that provided either by a certified accountant or finance director within their company. And then we would have other provisions that, obviously they've paid their taxes and that they have, they're occupying the building and the business is still there.
Mhm.
So, and then we have the provisions within that to, if that's in question, we just hold on to the funds until they prove it to our satisfaction.
Okay. So my concern is just the enforcement, is like in anything else in the city. Worry about,
Yeah.
we have it on the books, can we actually execute it and make it useful for us?
Yeah, in that regard, we actually have more authority and control than what we would typically have in a standard loan.
Yeah.
We're dependent on them making a payment. They are dependent on verifying that they have qualified for us to distribute the funds back to them.
All right. I would also put a plug in, I think essentially what Danny said. I don't want, as a board member, to have to get too involved in regularly enforcing or checking on specific contracts with all these folks.
Yes.
I think that takes us away from other things we need to be looking at. And I don't like the fact, well, if I'm a developer, I have a hard time going to an emotional board saying you're going to have the ultimate say over this versus I know up front my contract, I know what I have to hit, I know how I'm going to do it. It's reliable, and I can kind of take it to the bank, so to speak. So I want to say out loud, I don't want us to get too involved that way in saying we're going to be the ones who are going to say on an annual basis, do you get your TI or parts of it? So, thanks.
Thank you.
Further questions? I'm going to ask a couple things, and then there's some straw polls I would like to take. As was mentioned earlier, I would really like to make sure we have in there that the third-party review make sure that we are not making up the difference if they've overpaid for their property. And I'd like it to state that in there. All those in favor of that, or any discussion about it, I suppose. Yeah.
What do you consider overpaying for a property?
Well, if
I mean, because we know that
right,
a lot of the time when the county gives us our tax assessment, it's lower than what it
right,
what really is valued at.
and probably we need to define that. But if the gap that they are showing is the gap because they paid more than they should have,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know how best we measure that. You're right, but the spirit of that, of making sure that's not the gap we're filling because they made a bad purchase.
So maybe a follow-up for Jill and Danny, because I asked that question earlier, but in a little different way, Madam Chair, is like if the third-party evaluation comes back and says there's a discrepancy between their evaluation of market value and the actual price paid, how does that influence your decision on whether or not to provide a recommendation?
Ultimately, the way this would be structured is, as part of the agreement, you would put that they get a certain percentage of what their tax increment will be, and then you're going to have a cap or a maximum not to exceed amount. And once they hit that, we're done, or it gets stretched out for the life of what would be the project area. If you were concerned that part of the funding or the reimbursement amount was going towards overpaying for land, you could very easily just reduce that from what you would see as the cap. And just say, we realize you hit these criteria, we like the project, we like that you're doing jobs, but we feel that X amount of your request may be going towards land, and we're going to reduce it accordingly.
So I think that maybe that's a way to address it, is that that's part of the recommendation that comes before the council, is any discrepancy between the third-party evaluation of market rate and the actual price paid should be a point of discussion in that council review process.
And I think you could call that out on a dollar amount, you could call that out on a percentage amount, and then that could be part of what we would provide as staff analysis of, does it warrant paying for the land or does it not, and are you comfortable with that?
Is that sufficient, Madam Chair?
Yep.
I should just add that our goal with this project is to pay for bricks and mortar.
Right.
So our goal is to bring you what the gap analysis would be for actually construction. We typically don't ever reimburse for land acquisition. Our goal is to actually be tied towards what would be a burden or an increase in cost for construction. So,
and I think we just don't want to leave a loophole.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to know how that land acquisition may or may not fit within their overall budget. We tend to focus our reimbursement on hard construction costs.
So I know that this is probably in this type of project, it would be, I guess theoretically, counterproductive for a property owner to appeal their property assessment because their reimbursement's based on that assessment. But do we want to have language that says prohibits that as part of the agreement? And we've had that situation in other settings
Yes, we have.
where we've had property owners appeal their assessment after they got tax increment.
We typically include that in the agreement in terms of they cannot appeal or contest their tax payment without prior approval of the agency.
Okay.
And then obviously the back end protection for us is that if they appeal it, they don't
They
generate
don't,
it. and
they don't
only get
generate,
what
they don't get it, yeah,
So-
okay. But it has happened, so.
Right, it has
that's-
happened, and sometimes it's a legitimate reason of why it
Yeah,
happens.
and,
so
and
we will allow
lose
that, but
yes, and we risk losing a portion of that, whatever percentage we retain,
Yeah.
so.
yes.
The
So-
standard program actually, that there, if there's any offset, we would decrease their percentage of tax increment take and increase ours.
Board members, then, are you in favor of language then that makes sure that we are not funding that? All in favor of that? Okay, that is unanimous. That clear for you, along the lines of what
Yes.
Board Member Penfold said? You echoed back very well, I thought, so it seems
We
to me
will
you
include as
understand
part
it.
of the third-party review that the gap analysis includes that we are not overpaying for land, and we will provide that detail in terms of an amount over what we feel is the market rate, as well as what a percentage would be.
Great, thank you. And then finally, I like the idea that was proposed by someone that I'd like to know if you think it makes sense to require that applicant to offset the cost of the third-party analysis by including a fee for that?
So, yeah, I was thinking about that last night. Traditionally, it has not been the practice of the RDA to do a fee. We traditionally think of that as a built-in cost of us providing the service and doing business. However, to the extent that I would back up. First and foremost, at this point, we're only talking about doing 4 of these, so I would hope, number one, we've put a cap on what that exposure would be in terms of what the cost of the agency. I would probably say that we see how successful this program is, how many of these are we doing, and what those potential costs are before we propose that. And if we get to the point where we are discussing it for this program, I would actually ask that we take even a farther step back and see if that's something we want to do for some of our other programs and things. And I think that just needs to be part of a larger conversation that we are happy to come back and do an analysis for, but I wouldn't want to just put it in this program right now without kind of seeing the bigger picture or what the effect is on moving forward.
Board members, are you comfortable with that, holding off on that aspect and seeing what it looks like?
Yeah.
And seeing if we need to do that? Okay. Straw poll that. In favor of not adding that at this juncture? Thumbs up? Okay. All right, that is unanimous. Thank you very much. Then I will look for a motion to adopt the tax increment reimbursement policy program, and I'm assuming with the following changes.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I would propose that we tentatively adopt the tax reimbursement program with the modifications that were straw polled as part of this meeting.
Okay, any discussion? All right, yes.
May I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
Did we officially straw poll Director Rogers' request for the 70-80%?
Thank you for catching
'cause
that.
I'd like to
I
make sure
had
we
a
have
note to
that
myself
deal
to do that.
correctly.
I
Yes.
thought
Okay.
you were going to come back with some ideas.
Okay.
I don't know, is that wrong, council members? I just thought we'd come back with ideas to kind of tweak it a little bit.
What the percentage should be?
Starting at 70% and incrementing it up.
We can certainly do that.
Can
I
you,
just wanna
can
make
you
sure we're
live with
clear.
that at this juncture? Do you need that firmed up?
I can live with that to the extent that if we do bring you a project, you would be okay with approving it specific to that project, understanding that we may not have the details within the program fleshed out. But we can certainly incorporate your direction and concerns within the projects we're discussing today and understand that that last 10% is completely subject to the board approval at this point. So it's really your discretion of whether you want to give us some definition today that we can then work within, or if you want us to come back with ideas and have those ideas also be part of the next.
I mean, like I said, you guys are the professionals. I'd love to see what you
Okay.
come up with.
All right, we can do that, and we will incorporate that in our negotiations with the developers and
If you're
bring
okay
you
with that,
something that I
Madam Chair.
think you can vote on comfortably. We will make it aware that that last 10% is completely undecided at this
Right, and
point.
it might be the last 30% when we're finished.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we won't go
Right, yeah,
beyond 90.
20, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Well, you're the accountant and I'm the humanities major. All right, then, with that, clarification, all in favor of this motion?
Aye.
Any opposed? None. All right, then we have adopted these new
Thank you.
tax increment reimbursement policies with the changes as noted. Very good. All right.
All right.
Just a little bit behind, but we will press on.
Trying to catch up.
The past few weeks, we've been able to be here till 9:30 or 10. I figure that's important, you know? We want to make people.
Let me just be clear in this particular meeting that if we're here to 9:30 or 10, that it was the RDA's fault and not the council's
Okay.
fault.
It's Lisa Adams' fault.
That's
You-
probably the only time I get to make that
Okay,
exclusion.
That's good. All right, we would now like to invite Danny to stay at the table, and Suze, Lundmark, and is Ed joining you? Okay, great. This is an update on project area creation for the 9 Line and State Street areas, and originally we talked about having this a written briefing, but I thought there might be some questions about this since we've included the area that has the High Avenue HRC in it. So who wants to lead out on this? Suze?
Sure.
Good?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
I've
And if not, I'll defer to whomever you choose.
I can lead it. I guess just to sort of go through the information that was in the board memo, we wanted to give an update of where we are right now and where the direction that we're going is moving forward. So in terms of what we have done, the bulk of the community outreach was conducted about a year ago in terms of community councils and school community councils, open houses, individual stakeholder meetings. And then over this past summer, Tammy and I, to represent 9 Line and State Street, met with all of the city departments and divisions, except public utilities. They're still on our list. They're very busy. In terms of discussing the goals and objectives for the project areas and being able to incorporate their feedback into the project area plans. And I have to say that all of them had something that they wanted us to add, so we'll be able to incorporate those. Recently, our consultant, Lewis Young Robertson in Birmingham, finished the draft public benefits analysis for 9 Line and State Street, and we're reviewing that. We're going to be meeting with them to refine them, and then we'll have that to transmit to the board for the November board meeting. So that brings us to the timeline that's included in your board packet, showing where we are now. Today, we're giving the status update and proposed schedule, which is this proposed schedule. And in November, we would be ready to discuss the draft public benefits analysis. In December, we can transmit the draft redevelopment standards as well as the activities furthering Utah Title 17C, which are requirements in the law that have to go into the project area plan. And then we assume that we will be on track to be able to submit a transmittal in January of the draft project area plans and then the first draft of the project area budgets. So that's what we have outlined. However, we can, just depending on the input from the board and feedback that we receive, the timeline can be adjusted as needed. If we stuck to this timeline, we anticipate it would be possible that we could potentially have these adopted in the spring of 2018. And that would include the taxing entity consultations and then also a next round of public outreach, including the 30-day public comment period for the project area plans.
Okay, thank you. Board members, questions? Andrew?
Would it be the intent, this is going back to an earlier discussion about seed money that wasn't addressed in the CIP portion of this, Would the intent be to have an idea of what that would be by the time we finalize these in the spring? About seed money for each of the areas?
I think the intent would be to start the effort of setting aside funds so that as the project areas come on, and if we can start identifying projects, we would actually have some money ready to go for that.
Do we have a sense that with multiple projects, we'd have a certain equation that would lead us to how much seed money is provided?
No, it's
Nothing?
usually just a matter of trying to have the ability and flexibility that once the project area is created,
Mhm.
you could start doing something.
I'm thinking of High Street was added specifically because of what's happening in 2019, June, right? And there's some infrastructure in that area that could potentially be impacted by this concept. And we need probably to identify very quickly how much would be needed and what that would be. And that leads to a policy discussion, I guess, from our point on the board about if you have 3 project areas, how do you come up with how much seed money comes into each of those? Is it equitable? Is it a ratio? Is it some kind of concept? So I'd like to see us talk a little more about that coming up quickly so that we're hitting the ground running, specifically on the High Street one, in advance of that center coming online.
Further questions? I have several. Since this is the first time, I think, well, I've served that we've gotten to this step in creating a project area. So I'm interested in knowing, how is the length of time determined that a project area should exist? Because I know sometimes it's 15 years, sometimes it's 10 years. That's part one. I've got a multi-part question here. What criteria should be used in determining that? Next part, what data is reviewed in making the decision? And I would just state, I think we want to be careful not to avoid just an arbitrary amount of time. 20 years sounds good. You know, I want data to back up why we chose this amount of time. So you want to take a stab at answering those questions?
I will tell you, traditionally, project areas were 25 years. Early on, before changes, they were up to 30 years. And over time, that has been reduced down to 25. Now with what is the community reinvestment areas, there is no maximum or minimum in terms of project area life, and it is completely dependent on the project itself. This is one of the issues with how project areas are now created. We've kind of consolidated all of the RDA project area process into this community reinvestment area, which is great because it allows us to go out and be partners with the taxing entities. But we lost a lot of that standardized project area creation criteria that we used to have. And so the original intent for creating community reinvestment areas was that you would negotiate with the entities based on the specific projects. They are not designed still to do project areas. And so the reason I'm telling you that is because as agencies across the state have created these project areas for something like our single property development or specific projects, they are able to do very easily a cost-benefit analysis for that project that identifies what the specific costs are, what the increment will be thrown off, and how that budget will be applied and used. And so that is the data that is used to set up how much you need, what your time frame is, how much the increment will be thrown off every year, and then you tie that into what your ultimate life of the project area is. It's great. It's a nice, clean box and a way of doing it. When we look at trying to do a community reinvestment project area process that we now have to do for an area, we don't have that level of data because we are going back to what traditionally was redevelopment, which is just targeting a part of the city, collecting the increment, and then reinvesting that in the area to have it pick itself up. So for us, the 25 years is what has become kind of the acceptable standard of the other taxing entities for their level of participation. We have to go through the cost-benefit analysis with each of them, and they are asking all of those tough questions of, well, how much money do you need, what's it going to be used for, and when are you going to be done? Well, when you're looking at something like State Street, that's very hard to define if you're looking at redeveloping an area over the next 25 years. And so we will be challenged with doing our best guess of what we identify as those key projects to do, of what the area needs, and we will do our best to try to put together the data and the information of what we think those costs will be. But it is very hard to then turn that into something of how to tie the tax increment specifically to that. So With these project areas, what we are proposing is basically the traditional model of redevelopment, which is target an area, collect the increment, have the projects and the type of developments that you want to encourage and what you want to go after, but we don't necessarily all have all that hard data right now.
Okay, thank you. For any further questions? Erin?
I am just trying to be positive because I want it to go faster all the time. And I liked earlier this year when we were saying we would probably finalize it this fall. And now we're going to finalize it in the spring. Great. It's a good thing that we're going through all of this process. I understand that. And so my question was, in looking at the timeline, I didn't see where the other taxing entities are briefed and their feedback is incorporated. I heard you say, though, Suze, that potential spring fulfillment includes their participation, but when do you interact with them again and get their feedback again?
So if you look at the timeline we included, when we come back to you in November and have the discussion on starting to put together those pieces of the plan, we anticipate starting to reach out to the taxing entities at that point. Once we have some basic information, we want to start that conversation so that we are somewhat running parallel tracks with those conversations and the conversations with the city, so that if we start hearing things from the taxing entities, concerns, goals, objectives, we can then come back and report that to you as the city council and the board to make sure that if we have the opportunity to tweak it in the plan early on, we can. But ideally, you adopt the project area and you establish the plan, and then you use that as kind of your beginning for negotiations and conversations with the taxing entities. And so we'll start those earlier on because I think we're going to need that to have that extended conversation with them. But I anticipate once we start that we're probably looking at wrapping that up sometime in March. And I have to say, they are an entirely separate entity with an entirely separate process and governing body, and we have to go at their pace.
My last question is about, back to Andrew's question around seed money for the project areas, and particularly with the 2 HRCs in the State Street project area and the potential that those immediate vicinities may need infrastructure improvements, such as street lighting, perhaps. I don't know. Would it be helpful as we look at a bonding conversation if we had a conversation, not today, about getting more specific on what kind of seed money we may like to see for the project areas?
I think that is one thing that has really come out of the bond conversation, is that the biggest advantage to doing bonding for an RDA project area is doing it early on. And aligned with that is the fact that as we are looking at creating these new project areas, we probably also need to look at having those conversations with the other city departments about making sure that we're looking at how to align potential future CIP projects that the city would be doing, and making sure that we are trying to do those as early on in the project area as possible as well. It would be somewhat premature at this point to talk about bonding for these new project areas when we don't even have them established yet, but I think it would be very appropriate to start the conversation of what some of those projects would be that we'd want to look at early on. And if bonding is not necessarily a solution we can use yet today until the project area is approved, what could we do in terms of either RDA set-asides and or other programs that the RDA has that would be ready and able to go right away when the project area is created? So.
Okay, very good. Further questions? Thank you so much for giving us that timeline, updating us, and getting back to us on that. All right, we will move to item 5, the land disposition proceeds policy discussion. And I'm going to limit it to 15 minutes because we have pushed this off, and so I want to just start the conversation today. This is our first discussion on this, so we're just...
Okay, so in the interest of time, and Ed's going to correct me as I go through this and add to anything.
And can I invite Ben to join you?
Sorry.
And Jennifer, do you want to stay where you are or come over here? Okay, Jennifer, let's stay there. Okay, thank you so much.
Let me start by, and we'll just kind of highlight what some of the staff comments are, and hopefully we can cover everything in that time. The idea of the land disposition proceeds policy. As staff has looked at it, our goal has been to basically provide a framework that the board could use to guide future budget considerations, and when land sales proceeds come in, to have that, box within which that we can operate in terms of what we would ultimately want to do with those funds. And so the goal within this policy was to provide essentially that priority or tiering of how we would consider allocating those funds. And so we took a look at this policy, and our original goal was to somewhat structure it based on how the city does it, which is as land proceeds come in, it goes into a holding account, and then it's subject to reallocation by the city council. The only thing that we really changed within that is because of the way the RDA is structured in terms of project areas and funding and the housing requirements, we took that instead of one just main account, we did it to where that would also be allocated within the different project area funds. That's the way our budget is set up right now. That's the way it's structured in terms of revenue and tax increment coming in and out. So I don't think that was necessarily any added difficulty or amount of work. So that addresses the point number one within the council staff memo in terms of centralized surplus land. We would argue that we would still want to keep that within project areas as well as keep it separate with the housing. With regards to number two, which is dedicating a portion of the proceeds from land sales to citywide housing, the two comments I would make on that is, number one, once the funds would go into citywide housing and or be used for citywide housing, that's where they would stay. Based on the process that we've outlined, is that once it's spent in citywide, buy land, sell land, it goes right back into citywide. The second point I would make is that instead of having it where every time we had land sales proceeds sitting in an account that was subject to reallocation, I would really like for the staff and the board to work together that as part of every annual budget of the RDA, that is where we're having the discussion of how much of our budget should and needs to go towards housing. And so that as we do our projects and we buy property, that it's not every time that proceeds come in that we have to have a discussion of what goes towards housing. It is part of our annual budget. And so to the extent that we go out and do projects and buy property and we get proceeds and it drops down to this holding account, when we reallocated that as part of the annual budget, it would then be part of the larger discussion of how much of the agency's funds are going to housing. And that is a program and a policy that we are starting to work on and look to bring the board so that it guides our larger funding discussions, not just every time we seem to get an extra, amount of cash. So I would ask that we just have that conversation be part of the annual budget. With regards to number three from the staff, I would say that obviously the goal of having the funds potentially go into PIF is that it gives us the flexibility, and then we can apply that flexibility with how we want to spend the funds in the future. I would argue you have that ability already within the program that we've proposed. Within priorities number 2 and number 3, with number 2, you have the ability that if you have a project that is either in a separate project area or spans across multiple project areas, you could just as easily have PIF be the holding account for those funds, and then you just identify what that project is. So it doesn't necessarily matter where the holding account is, as much as you would be able to build in that flexibility that you would want with PIF into whatever allocation you have and where those funds go. So I think we're already accomplishing that. And then number 3, same with that. The flexibility that you would want in putting money in the program income fund, you would also get if you put money in the revolving loan fund, because that's just a more specific use of where those funds would go. So I think that's our response to the 3 comments within the council staff memo. Ed is here if you would like him to talk through the process and the flow chart that we've envisioned, but in the interest of time, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Great. I'll give
Ed,
Danny
go
a
ahead.
break from
Go
talking.
and be fast. And I'm going to say, board members, think about this and hold your questions for the follow-up conversation.
Great.
Next
So the first part I'll say is what really will determine this is what was the original source of the property was purchased with.
Yeah.
So the example we use is Station Center and Parcel 1. We have an agreement with Cowboy Partners to do a development there. We went back in our records and we identified this was purchased with money from Program Income Fund and funds that were generated in tax increment in the Depot District. So then based on this plan, that we sell the property successfully to Cowboy Partners, we get a profit, and that money would go into a holding account in the Depot District Project Area Fund. Now, either through a budget opening or a budget amendment or an annual budget, the RD staff would come forward with a proposal of how to spend those funds. So the first one would be we would analyze the project area to see if there's any opportunity within that project area to to recycle those funds back in there. If it's determined that there's not, let's say we're at the end of a project area's life, or we've succeeded in implementing the project area plan goals, then it would go to number 2. And this would be then identifying what other project areas we have maybe a funding gap, or we have other priority projects that the board and the RDA director would like to accomplish. This includes seed funds or anything like that. Then if for a reason we've not identified that there's a need there, then the third would be, and these are guidelines, a third would be the revolving loan fund. And this would be recommended to go in the revolving loan fund that we'd provide loans based on our policy there. Now the second example we have is how citywide housing works. So the RDA did purchase the 444 South 900 East Old Quantisville with citywide housing funds, and we actually did receive a profit from, or a return on investment on that one. So these funds would then automatically go into citywide housing. They would still have to go and be appropriated through a budget opening or the annual budget into citywide housing, but then they would be determined through that what is the specific use for those funds. And so we would keep those funds recycling through to fund an additional affordable housing project based on the citywide housing fund.
Okay, great. All right.
I'm holding my question.
Okay, yeah.
Okay,
Hold your
great.
question. Jot it down, remember it. Yeah, you have to remember it. Yes.
Stretch that.
Okay, Stan, I'll let you ask if you insist. Go ahead.
I think it's pretty quick. Ed, you looked at initially assessing the original source of funds for that purchase, and you gave the example that maybe it was PIF money. Did you look at a determination of putting any percent of that back into like project income fund? And I'm only asking that because that tends to be a more flexible funding source. I mean, did you evaluate that in this process?
We did, and actually, because the money's already been spent in the project area, the whole amount of the proceeds could go back to PIF or be considered essentially PIF eligible because they've essentially been spent. They don't have to go back to the project area, so that's why the guideline is there. But you could also do a recommendation where if we spend $600,000 in PIF, then that automatically goes back to PIF, or the percentage could be that.
I was just interested in if you had assessed that because I didn't realize, I guess, that you can take that entire revenue now out and put it into PIF because
Correct.
it's okay.
Yep.
Once it is touched, PIF dollars,
Yep.
it's
So
all can be sucked back
correct.
in.
The initial expense of tax increment was to purchase that property.
Okay,
so
one
the
more.
tax increment was
I've
spent.
got one follow-up.
One
to
more
that,
question.
yeah.
Okay.
You
You still have 5 minutes.
There are
Okay.
some situations in the past, and I'm thinking of Marmalade in particular, where we've made a policy discussion saying where the land revenue will actually complete the project area stuff. So how's that accommodated in here? Is that still part of that process of reinvesting it in the project area?
Yeah, so that'd be an example is the board did find impact fee money for the Marmalade Park, but that would be an example where when we sell the property to Clearwater, that staff could come forward and let's say there wasn't a funding there, and we could propose that that money stays in West Capitol Hill and then is used to fund the park.
Again, it becomes program income fund money once it's sold.
Exactly, or
So-
it goes back into
I
the
think the
project area.
original conversation was saying, you know, back in a timeline where we thought that would all happen before the end of the project, it would fund it, but we did it a different mechanism.
Yeah, and that was, again, going back to where it's the board's decision where ultimately that money goes to. It would just be guiding staff of what would be that recommendation.
Can I have a follow-up?
James?
So my question would be, is there any policy or ordinance that keeps or prevents us from, say, getting the proceeds and dividing them up between these two funds, the project area fund as well as the citywide housing fund?
Nope, there's nothing in place right now that would prevent us from doing that, other than, as I said, we would like to have those conversations as part of the overall budget, because once money goes towards housing, it is always in housing, and so that's why I would be a little leery to build that within the program as a requirement, as much as you always have that option to do that at any time. And so I wouldn't want it to be a requirement as much as leave it as an option for future allocations.
I was just trying to clarify that there is nothing preventing us from splitting it.
No.
Okay.
Okay, any further questions on that? All right, thank you very much. Then item 6, report and announcements from the executive director. And I feel bad, she was here and I was going to acknowledge her, and now she is not. But
I
Danny,
was
do you
actually
have
going to
anything?
go back and
Okay.
ask,
Yeah.
is the board comfortable with making a approval or decision on the land proceeds policy?
No, this is
okay.
well, board members, I promised more conversation on this. Are you?
Been on the agenda for so long,
Right, but
I'm
this
just
is our,
asking more of a
this is our
clarification
first
of-
time that
right.
we've been able to do it.
So I
since
wanted to make
promised
sure
we'd
that
bring it back.
I was clear
but-
that that was just a discussion and we'll bring it back.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
thank you.
well, it'll be on the November agenda. Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you. And no report from me as the chair. Anything, Vice Chair? All right. And we didn't have any written briefings. I am going to recess our meeting, and we will reconvene following the work session. And at that point, we will address the consent agenda.
Madam
Okay.
Chair,
Yes.
before we recess, just a question with our,
Yes.
looking forward to the public, is the public benefit analysis? No, yeah, for the project areas in November.
Yes, yes.
Do you think that the investigation staff is doing around places we might be able to explore as a board, similar to State Street redevelopment?
In terms of wanting to look at areas of investment right now?
In thinking about the timeline of our adoption of the plan for the State Street project area, will we be able to explore through the
So we have
travel or whatever means
proposed,
staff was exploring?
we have proposed for the discussion in December to actually, we've titled it Geographic Target Areas. And the purpose of that is within those two project areas, if there are things that the board would like us to start calling out specifically for.
No, that's
for
not what I mean,
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Remember in a previous meeting where I asked that we do an exploratory trip as a board the way that we used
Oh,
to do?
yeah.
Yeah.
And you said that staff was looking into that?
Yes, so what we have determined with that is we will come back to the board in January with a list of potential locations. And at that point, we will get direction from you on which ones you would maybe like to go and tour and see. But we are not able to have that conversation until after the election of new council members, because we are not able to do any travel
We
right
can
now.
talk about it
But
in
no,
December
we're
then.
not talking about travel away. You're talking
No.
about travel within
No,
the
I'm-
areas. You're talking about wider travel.
Yes,
Okay.
but I'm
Yeah.
saying that we can talk about it before an election. We can't travel before.
Yeah.
But
But
we
where
can
the
talk
places
about
would
If
be.
it.
that's where, that's different than
Okay.
what we.
I
but we
just
can
don't
certainly
want to
bring that.
delay, if there's potential for us to
Yeah.
finalize those project areas in March, I don't want to delay that because we're still learning about
Sure.
ways other cities have done it. And if we can expedite the travel planning
Like you would like it
conversations.
done in January if possible, right?
Well, I'd
Early
like-
on, so
I don't
you
want to
can move it
postpone
along.
talking about it when
Yeah.
we actually don't have to postpone talking about it.
We can bring you a list of potential.
North Dakota and
locations.
Michigan might be really good spots to
Which one?
visit. North Dakota and Michigan, you might just want to do those in January. Standing on a beach, right, somewhere.
Yes, we will bring you that
I'm thinking
list.
that there ought to be an ex officio trip to
Thank you.
Hawaii, perhaps.
Yeah,
Enough.
that
Yeah.
might work.
Thank you.
Okay,
Very
thank you. Does
much.
that give you the clarification,
Yes,
both
it
of you,
does.
that
Thank
you
you.
needed? Then we will recess this meeting and reconvene following the work session, at which point we will address the consent agenda, which is setting the date for budget amendment and for RDA housing funding.
And I believe we also have a closed session with RDA when we reconvene.
We do not have a closed session with RDA, according to our
Yeah.
attorney.
Just you will be able to have the conversation in public because the pieces that had been appropriate for executive session are now
Public
Done.
anyway.
which we didn't know would be the case. So we are preserving all options.
Clearly, I'm not keeping up on my texts and emails during a meeting.
You didn't-
We weren't that far yet.
Yeah, that's because my attention is fully focused
Yes.
on Danny and grilling him.
We're surprising you right now.
Yes.
Yes.
So with that, and I would look to the council chair, when would you like to reconvene for the work session? Since we've had
Let's
everybody
say
sitting
at
for 2.5 hours.
4:45.
Okay, and strictly in 15 minutes. Thank you so much.